This week we're going to talk about interfaith spaces. I'm really excited for our conversation. And I'm using the word interfaith here intentionally, but not exclusively, because I'm thinking about the way that a term like interfaith emphasizes in that prefix inter, um, the interactions between groups of people or within a group of people. So, an emphasis on the interaction between people, and also regarding faith, that it's not just about religious ideas or systems, the way a term like interreligious or multi-religious might mean, but here trying to emphasize that aspect of lived religion or faith in particular environments, locations, periods, and so on, right? So contextual. So that's what I'm thinking when I'm using a word like interfaith spaces. And we'll be looking at just a few examples here. When it comes to a word like multi-religious, for example, that's a word that, you know, it is also fine to use. We'd note that the world has been multi-religious for a very long time, of course, because there have been multiple religions operating in a given society or community. Thinking back to earlier in our semester and the ancient Roman Empire, or even just the city of Rome on its own, as a kind of microcosm, was very religiously diverse. But in that case was united under the idea of Romanness or Romita, like Romanitas. Interfaith spaces are really common among or in environments like university campuses, hospitals, and airports. And maybe you are already, for those of you who are in interreligious chaplaincy, are maybe already aware of the International Association of Civic Aviation Chaplains, which have conferences and official website and all of that. Anyway, but these kinds of environments are the typical place where we see interfaith chapels or interfaith spaces. And things that they share in common is that they are often accommodating large, diverse, and mobile communities. And in some cases, communities that are in high stress situations. So, in the case of hospitals, of course, people who are either sick themselves or maybe visiting someone who's ill. Travel can sometimes be stressful, and so on, right? So it's this kind of, and even in the university setting, a relatively transient community that's, there for a period of time, maybe 2 to 4 years. So we'll think about, or maybe notice, what are the implications then for designing a space as opposed, that's serving this kind of function and community, as opposed to, say, a synagogue that has been around for 100 years in the U.S., right? Or designing a new space for a community that's maybe going through a transition, but is going to be, a relatively stable, permanent community, right? So there's different kinds of needs and functions that go along with that. So in this lecture, I'm just going to look at a handful of examples, maybe 5, and we'll look at some examples from each of these categories. So university campuses, hospitals, and airports. So we're going to start by going to Kansas City, to Children's Hospital. And here is one example of an interfaith chapel. And you'll maybe already notice some of the themes that we've seen in religious spaces in the sacred spaces of various religions in our class already, right? So the goal for this is to create a contemplative space for for visitors and for patients. You'll note it's really filled with light. Of course, they're using natural elements, so this wood furniture was custom made for the space. It's movable, although not as movable as individual chairs, right? And by this kind of the curvature of these benches has a kind of gathering or grouping feel to it. Cushioned for comfort, that's something we'll notice a lot in these chapel spaces, especially ones in hospitals and airports, where people are thinking about the physical comfort of the people who are coming in. There's space for wheelchairs. Um, the furniture is movable, but you get the sense from the space, because it's kind of wider than it is deep, that it's going to typically be this kind of orientation. And then you also have, lots of windows. So we have natural light coming in. There's a garden visible on the outside. And then you have this wood cutout screen here that kind of diffuses the light and serves as a backdrop for speakers at the front of the room. And then these, I don't know, kind of reflective or glass elements that catch the light in nice ways, right? So there's no religious iconography. There's not much in the way of the visual art, and so it really is kind of a not totally a blank slate, not the blankest of slates, but there's kind of these curved surfaces. It has a feeling of like warmth, light, and gathering, right? Maybe those are some words that I would use to describe that. Um, the floor also has natural elements. So there's a wood floor, and then the carpeting that's used here has these kind of organic little tree-like decorations. Um, and so it's very much, using natural elements, kind of emphasizing or connecting to the natural landscape that's even visible in a snippet out there. Um, and I suppose this screen is kind of leaf-like or water-like, pebble-like, kind of evokes those um, types of things. And these are glass orbs. I don't know what I just said a second ago, but and they can be illuminated from within, but are also, catch light, the natural light as well, right? There's also an end of life suite that's attached to the chapel. So for young patients who are needing that kind of care, can still have access to this space, and kind of, I suppose, keep them connected to a quieter space than as opposed to like the regular wings in the hospital. Okay, so that's one context, and obviously for a children's hospital, it's focused towards children and their families primarily. The next one we're going to look at is in Connecticut and Stamford. This is an interfaith chapel that one of the kind of major visual elements, or the major feature of the chapel, is this glass installation by Gordon Huether, or Huther. So it's kind of it's really an architectural element in that way. And you can see it fills this whole wall. As we enter the chapel, it will then occupy most of that wall too. Again, we could say emphasis on natural or evoking natural elements. So it's made with colored glass, and there's also pebbles inserted along here, almost like tile work, and that runs throughout the chapel. So it's kind of a unifying feature between the outside and the inside, leads us into the inside. And this, I think evokes water, clouds, and a blue sky. And obviously having these like smooth pebbles down here makes that feel kind of water-like. So is meant to instill sense of like peace and tranquility. The idea of, a creek, and you can almost maybe hear those water-like sounds. And here's the interior. So again, the pebble, kind of like tile work, is located all around the edge of the floor. Go back for a second. Um, very comfortable seats, as I just mentioned before about seating. It's not natural light, but it has that kind of, probably using the, what's it called? You know, like those daylight light bulbs. There's, you know, furnishings, so podiums and a table, um, very comfortable chairs, benches along the edge as well. And then that the wall doesn't go all the way to the floor, but has a panel of glass underneath it. So there's still light. So it's very much, you know, has kind of these um, warm elements through the use of wood, bright light, and incorporating, you know, the wood, of course, is a natural element. There's kind of a matte type rug here. And then those smooth stones. So it feels like you're kind of, I don't know, in a cloud or nearby a stream. It's quite small. It's not seating a huge number of people here. Um, it's what, 16. Um, so it's an intimate kind of space, right? And is really around the, I mean, it was designed with this artwork in mind. So the artist was commissioned to make it, and that was concurrent with the construction of the new building. Things, and so again, the chairs are movable here, but things I want to think about in our conversation together is about orientation in these spaces, the flexibility of the spaces, kind of the assumptions maybe that are expressed or revealed by the design of the spaces, those kinds of things. So again, there's no explicit religious iconography. Um, it could really be used for anything, couldn't it? um, but it has this sense of maybe a peaceful environment. All right, from here, I'd like to move on from universities, or not from university, from hospital settings to university setting. I'm just going to look at one example, although we'll close with a united example at the end. Um, so this chapel, which is an award-winning chapel, it's called the Fred and Faye Haas Memorial Interfaith Chapel. It's at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Prescott, Arizona. So it accommodates about 100 people, and the architect Patrick Kane, who's based in Vermont, uh, got got the commission for this design actually after the previous. So he wasn't their first choice. The previous architectural firm did not hit the budget number that they wanted. Right, they needed a lower budget, and so they sought other bids, and so Patrick Kane meant that, and then not only that, his final construction ended up coming in $600,000 under the budget for the project. So he had in mind a modest chapel, and he worked with his brother, who was a landscape architect based in Arizona, and they worked together to cut costs. And they were also intentional about, or yeah, intentional about minimizing or trying not to negatively impact the natural habitat. This is in a kind of suburban region, and you can see some of the national environment is overlooking a lake below. So it's about 3,000 square feet. Like I said, it accommodates 100 people. You can see here that it slopes up, and the main focus is this room, which the building plan is flipped the opposite way, but here's that main room. and a whole wall of windows here. So it has this large overhang roof, which provides much needed shade to the interior during, well, because of the Arizona sun. Um, and then it's also just one big room. So this both protects the interior from the sun, but it also is big enough to allow natural light in, during winter months or when there's not as much sun. Um, it's very kind of modern, what we would call like quote unquote like clean lines. And that's in part practical. A lot of this design is very practical and low cost. And one of the ways it's low cost is that it helps cut the air conditioning costs for the building because it's keeping the room relatively small and open, so you don't have to um, you know climate control many elements. Um, Here's a review from kind of the opposite side of the building. From where we just kind of by the entrance. And the interior, which there weren't very many great shots of, but this gives you a little bit of a sense. So there's, even though it has this kind of maybe more, not quite industrial look, but unfortunate that on the right hand side it's just being used for like a university event and not a chapel space. So it's kind of hard to get a sense of how it's actually used by interfaith communities at the institution. But you see, there's just a beautiful view, lots of natural light, warmth from the wood, which can kind of um, maybe evoke the warmth of other. I'm thinking of kind of like 19th century uh, churches that have wooden ceilings and so on. Um, Again, no religious iconography, not much in the way of liturgical elements that are out and available. And I guess I should have also given the caveat too that I'm showing you some examples here. I'm not lifting any of these up as like amazing examples, but just showing kind of what's out there. It's also interesting as I was preparing this and like searching for university chapels that, tons of universities have interfaith chapels, but it's also interesting that very few of them include images of the chapels on their websites, or you kind of have to do some digging around for them. Anyway, that's but a side note. Um, okay, so here's one example. It will end too with United's Bigelow Chapel. But one more stop, which is the Atlanta airport. And the Atlanta airport, if you've ever been there, you know that it is a sprawling, gigantic airport and you need lots of time to make your connection. I have so many memories of just running through the airport with luggage trying to make connecting flights. But anyway, for that reason, it maybe doesn't surprise you that there are not one, but three interfaith chapels at the Atlanta airport. So we're going to look at all three of them. Some are more successful than others, we'll say. So here's the entrance to one. And here it is. That's it. So again, it's pretty small, comfortable chairs. Interesting that there's a row facing away. But kind of soft feeling. There's no natural light, not surprising in an airport, but kind of warm but bright light. A table at the front. Again, no religious iconography of any kind or symbolism. A TV, which I guess can show these images. So there's some flexibility there, I suppose. But it also feels a little bit like a movie theater. So that's a choice that people made. A wooden ceiling, again, has that feeling of warmth and the use of natural elements, but pretty more or less minimalist. The next one, there's a guitar. Also, well, these chairs don't feel very permanent, so these are just folding plastic chairs. We have a big, the whole wall is occupied by this, image of leaves changing and kind of tranquil body of water, right? What I find, and we see two men standing in prayer. It seems that they're orienting themselves in a particular direction, right? There's a podium here, not great lighting, and then a pretty weird choice, if you ask me, of a detail from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and the creation of Adam. I kind of wonder if those are flipped the other way, actually. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm gonna Google that real quick. But this is what I mean by what's, yeah, I'm looking it up. Oh, no, it's fine. Okay, that is Adam's in the right. For some reason, I thought that it kind of looked flipped. Okay. But that's a strange choice to me to put at the front of this room because, of course, one, it's from the ceiling of a famous Catholic church. And so, two, that's centric or tied to the Abrahamic faiths then, because of the story of creation of Adam. And even in a Christian context, this would be a weird image to have at the front of a chapel. It's not, it's one thing to have it on the ceiling, but you wouldn't ever see this in an apse, or above an altar in a church. So it gives me the sense that the person who, I don't want to be too critical, I guess, but it makes me question the reasons for doing it. It seems like kind of an afterthought, and it looks a little bit like the kind of frame that you have in like a hotel. So I question the intentionality of displaying that image. It almost would feel better to have no image there, personally, but would love to hear what you all think about that. The third chapel is actually what I think is probably the least successful of the three. And it's true that in some instances, I should say, in many instances, probably, specifically in hospitals and maybe most commonly in airports, it's the case that a chapel space is adapted from an existing space, right? So it's not that the chapel was designed to be a chapel. It's that, oh, we're going to add a chapel, and we'll incorporate it, or we'll use this room, right? We'll adapt this existing room. And I think that's part of why you can maybe contrast it with the Stanford Hospital example, which was designed as a chapel, a little bit more intentional feeling, right? As opposed to these airport ones. Good Lord, look at this. If this isn't depressing, I don't know what is. So there's those same plastic folding chairs. You can see there is a person on a rug in the front of the room. And sometimes in interfaith chapels, and especially in airports where people are going to be even more kind of mobile, right? There might be, pillows for people to use for meditation or rugs for people to use in prayer. So there might be some implements or elements. But honestly, this lighting is pretty terrible. There's like a fluorescent lighting along this glass window. It's very small here. It's also seating 16, but in a way that feels really cramped because the chairs are right up against the wall. I have a little table with some books laid out on it, presumably from different traditions. And then this, oh gosh, and then this image at the front of the room. of a person kneeling, in prayer. I don't know why that makes sense to signal on the outside, hey, the chapel's in here, but is that really the image that you want to have at the front of the room? Is a little strange. What is really great about this space, though, is that somebody marked the direction towards Mecca, so the Qibla. And I really like that. So the people who use it have found a way to make it useful for future worshipers coming to the space, right? So these are the kinds of things, like when we're having an interfaith space, can we, how can you mark something that's needed, like the Qibla, um, you know, like the direction towards Jerusalem, or, towards the east, depending on, of course, where the um, building is located and all those kinds of things, right? Okay, I'm going to move on to my next one. When we get together this week, I'm going to be, well, no, let me move on to my next one before I get ahead of myself, of course. So this next one I'm showing you is distinct from the others in that it's more of a freestanding, kind of unattached interfaith chapel space. I mean, it's literally freestanding. It's not in a hospital or an airport. It is associated with the Cathedral of Hope, which is a United Church of Christ, cathedral. They don't, well, okay, side note, because you know that cathedral comes from the Latin word cathedra, which means seat or chair, which means that a cathedral is the seat of a bishop. So to have a UCC church called the Cathedral of Hope is kind of funny because the UCC doesn't have bishops. But I guess the Cathedral of Hope was an MCC church, and then they had these cathedrals and then no bishops and whatever. So I don't, whatever. That's neither here nor there. The point is that the Cathedral of Hope is now UCC, and they're still called the Cathedral of Hope. Sidebar. Um, so this chapel is associated with the Cathedral of Hope, but it is designed as an interfaith chapel by Philip Johnson. It's about 8,000 square feet and can accommodate about 176 people, and is used for interfaith worship, for conferences, for weddings. So it is a kind of a multifunctional space. And what you'll immediately notice, I think, is that there are no right angles here on the exterior of the building. It does feel, it's kind of got these, it has this all white exterior, very kind of geometric like, and then very warm lighting from the inside. So it has that kind of illuminated from within. And that's, I think, kind of reinforced by these almost flame like or leaf like, but I think because of the light, read kind of as flame like here. So maybe a lantern or a lamp illusion, not illusion. So we can, here's the other side. Kind of walk around. And here's the interior. So there is a platform / stage. And there is, as you can see, it's being, like I said, multifunctional, right? So it really is kind of like, it's not exclusively an interfaith chapel. It serves that function, but then is also obviously used for all manner of events. So is like interfaith chapel plus, yes. But there's no right angle, so it has that, maybe you could say that that was intentionally designed so as to, I don't know, does that like kind of reflect ideologically, like there's no there's no right angles and there's no one way, right? There's kind of this organic gathering sense. The goal of reconciliation of various communities. Okay, in closing, I'm going to end with the Bigelow Chapel, which was on United's old campus in New Brighton, if you haven't been. Um, this was designed by the firm HGA. It won 11 different architectural awards. It was built in 2004, as you can see, and there was a major campaign to get the funds to do this. And the thing about chapels at seminaries and divinity schools, as opposed to at a university, is that when you're training people who are going into ministry, a chapel space functions as a kind of lab often. What I mean by that is people, well, as you many of you know, folks who are going into ministry need those opportunities to kind of practice their liturgical craft, as it were, to design liturgies, to implement them, to think about how to use a physical space and so on, right? So it means that, even at like, say, a kind of like old school Christian seminary that's going to be ecumenical. So I'm thinking of like Yale Divinity School, which is you know, probably still pretty much exclusive Christian seminary or divinity school, I think. Um, but their chapel space is a kind of blank slate with clear windows and white walls. It had some pillars. It fits into the architectural like style of the campus, and so it has a kind of 19th century feel. Has a fancy organ up in the loft, um, but it has a central plan. So usually the seats are in the round, but it can be used many different ways for the uses of different Christian denominations, primarily in that context, right? United has been ecumenical and an interreligious interfaith for some years, and as you all know, increasingly so in the last few years. So even at the time when this was designed, more than 15 years ago, it was intended to be or created as a non-denominational, ecumenical, and interfaith space. At the time, there was chapel twice a week. There were lectures and concerts. It needed to accommodate things like liturgical dance and art exhibits, performances, and it was rented out for weddings and funerals as well. It could seat about 200 people. And so, because of all of these things, everything was movable within it. So you can see, again, lots of natural elements. This is on the east side of the quad. So those windows are on the west side of the building. So there's a big green lawn here, and then on the right-hand side, it would attach to a wing of classrooms, and then there was another wing on this other side. Just kind of reference to a bell tower here. We have this cantilever that mostly provides, protection from sun and rain. There's a set of exterior doors here, and then the set of doors here connect to the hallway that connects to the other buildings. So we have stone, glass, and then this warm wood, which is a maple. So let's get to the interior of the building. So this is on the inside. You can see it's oriented this way. I don't think I ever saw it used that way. More commonly, in my short time on the old campus, it was used the wide way, where the speaker would be in front of the wood panels, and then the chairs would often be kind of in the round. But you could also have it, everything's highly adaptable and movable. So you've got wood paneling above, these very organic shapes, and that maple would contract and expand based on the weather, and so would creak and make different noises in the winter and summer. So even though it is intended as this kind of ecumenical, and maybe more ecumenical than interfaith, honestly, because you can note that there's a cross inscribed in the stone here, and there's another one on the exterior as well. Here's some of the other ways that it was used. So this window here, actually, I don't know if you can see, yeah, it's kind of nice here. there's a tree planted right outside this window, which is a really lovely kind of little composition. There's a meditation garden right there. So the long ramp comes down. It's how you would enter the space, and there's also a small set of stairs right there. So it's accessible. Um, and this also operated as a gallery. So artwork would be displayed along here, and then also along that long hallway that I mentioned towards the classrooms. And this might remind you of, say, clear story windows or the windows at the base of the dome of Hagia Sophia. We're a long way off from Hagia Sophia here, but it has a kind of a similar function. And the chairs could be totally removed, and it could be used for seated meditation. Like I mentioned, they're also rented out for weddings and other functions, right? So we'll end there. I'd like to talk about our chapel on the new campus too, but because I wasn't happy with the photos that I was finding, I'll just encourage you to go to the United website, go to the About Us page, and then scroll down. And if you haven't seen it already, there's a virtual tour space, and then you can look at the new United Chapel, if you haven't already viewed that. And I can pull that up in class as well. All right, so that's where I'm going to leave us for now. In class, we're going to be brainstorming together about elements of interfaith space design, and especially interfaith chapels. And the kind of question I want to pose to you and think about together is, how do we find a balance between the kind of, what I would argue are kind of uninspired, too blank spaces that verge on being meaningless, not distinguished between any other kind of space, right? On one end, and on the other side, I think the other end of that spectrum might be a space that uses architectural language that privileges one religious tradition over others. So one example, what I mean by that is, in some of the university chapels I found in my research, several of them employed pretty Gothic-esque architecture, pointed arches and high ceilings and that kind of thing. And as we know, because I think I've mentioned, or maybe it was my art history class, sorry, that Gothic architecture wasn't solely used for churches. It was also, there were synagogues that were designed with built in the Gothic style. There were civic buildings, and the homes of aristocrats and whatever. It wasn't just used for churches, but that's primarily what we associate it with now. And uh, the buildings that survive in the Gothic style today are primarily churches, right? So for an interfaith chapel to use Gothic architecture, I think, or I would argue, does implicitly reference Christian architecture. And if you're not going to represent other religions architecturally, then I think it kind of privileges Christianity over others. Anyway, so that's kind of my question of, how do we make a beautiful space, and one that signals as like, hey, this isn't just a conference room, this is a sacred space, right? There's a difference between that too. It's not just merely a functional space, but is one that maybe, invites meditation, or is, beautiful, or, has these other kinds of effects depending on the context and so on. So I can pose some more questions to you when we're together. I'm really looking forward to the conversation this week. More soon.